Okay, how do we fix the government?
The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
You know, we don't script this show, and when the director says, okay, 3, 2, 1, go, I just say what I think about what the show is going to sound like. And as the little ribbon of intro starts there, I think, well, isn't that something what you probably choked on your beer, your coffee, or your whatever you were consuming when you did so, if you were. How do you fix the government? It's got to be the biggest, weirdest question. And what government? Where? Your town hall? The state of Rhode Island? That thing in Washington that is just a story you can't write? Well, we'll land in the middle tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about the state government, and it's a result of, this conversation is a result of the turbulence that surrounds the General Assembly right now, and specifically the Speaker of the House and his audit request or demand or directive for the Convention Center Authority, which was the subject of last night's show. And a little tidbit, we can't run highlights of last night's show because we're doing tonight's show yesterday. On Thursday, we tape both Thursday and Friday shows. So we don't work on Friday. And if anything blows on this story or something else, we catch up on Monday. And the point being that if you missed last night's show, please go to foxprovidence.com. You discussed the situation with the executive director of the Convention Center Authority, who has as many questions reportedly about what went on, perhaps nefariously, as anybody, he says, at this point. And you'll get the role of that play-by-play by watching the show. And of course, by checking Target 12 at WPRI.com, because the story really began with the typical outstanding investigative journalism by Tim and Ted and Eli and the whole crew there. Once upon a time, we learned that the Convention Center Authority had been told they were getting an audit from the Auditor General, who reports to the Speaker of the House. Well, he reports to the General Assembly, but the way the culture is, the Speaker runs the whole thing. And actually, that's part of the conversation we're going to have tonight, is that the way the whole thing is supposed to work. I could go through down the list of headlines and chronicle the whole story, but it really is semi-secondary to the conversation we're going to have tonight, which is how do we make the General Assembly work better so these things don't necessarily have to happen. But at the beginning of this, Nick Mattiello, after Target 12 had reported that he ordered this audit, answered some questions on newsmakers, and it was very uncomfortable.
Did you violate the statute by ordering the audit?
No, we always operate through the chairman, like every board across the country
We should
does.
point out you're the chairman.
I'm the chairman of the committee. I inquired of one person, and I was told that it was basically a personnel matter, and I had no other involvement with that.
So the personnel matter had to do with the director of security for the convention center and his reported tryst with the assistant general manager of the facility that was going sideways, and the Speaker wanted to see that thing quelled for his friend and ally, and when it didn't quell, reportedly, that's when the threats began to happen. Tim White's latest story that came on the air Wednesday night of this week kind of capsulizes it, gives you enough taste of the story to wet your whistle, and then we'll talk about the bigger picture with my guest tonight.
Target 12 has learned detectives from the Rhode Island State Police interviewed Veteran Convention Center Authority board member Paul McDonald on Tuesday. On Newsmakers earlier this month, House Speaker Nicholas Mattiello confirmed he discussed the personnel investigation into his friend and Convention Center Director of Security James Demers with someone connected to the Convention Center.
I inquired of one person, and I was told that it was basically a personnel matter, and I had no other involvement with that.
Target 12 12 has learned that person was McDonald, and the conversation was described as tense. Mattiello has repeatedly denied the audit was in retaliation for the personnel investigation into Demers. He has since rescinded the audit after Target 12 brought the situation to light. The state police also interviewed Convention Center Chairman James McCarville Tuesday. Both McDonald and McCarville have not returned a call for comment. As Target 12 previously reported, state law says performance audits, like the one Mattiello ordered, require a majority vote from the Joint Committee on Legislative Services, or JCLS, the administrative arm of the General Assembly. But other members of the JCLS tell us that vote never happened. Last week, the head of the Convention Center's board told Target 12 they were stunned when they received the audit.
We realize that there's a 5-person committee that makes that decision, and only one person made it. So we were quite upset about it.
Understandably so. Gary Sasse is one of my go-to guys when it comes to smart government. I'd say good government, but that's not, I think smart means good. But you've been about smart and been, I think, a real resource for us here and to the state, not only in your career, but through your current position at Bryant, through the leadership project that you've got up there. And you can never take the state government out of the guy, right?
That's right.
The guy can leave the state government, but you're gonna, it's still inside you. Welcome. Good to see you again.
My pleasure.
Gary actually signaled that he would like to talk about the bigger picture about how the state government works. Before I get to that, at your leisure and comfort zone, tell me what you think about this saga that has caused all this consternation.
Well, the saga is caused because the structure that the legislature operates its administration under is not transparent, it's not accountable. And I'll go back, if you let me go down memory lane, to 1992. I had the privilege of chairing a Blue Ribbon Commission the legislature appointed. And the objective of the Blue Ribbon Commission was to put together a blueprint for the assembly to operate in the 21st century. And a lot of good things came from that report. Legislative compensation was changed, got rid of pensions, reduced the size of the legislature. All very positive things. But the legislature, that report also had a section on management, making the legislature more accountable. And if those recommendations, which were largely ignored, were put in place today, we would not be having this conversation at all. And the recommendations were very simple. On the management side, it said, for example, that the employees of the joint JCSL should have formal job descriptions. They should be evaluated against those job descriptions. It said that the JCSL should hold regular and published meetings and adopt rules and personnel policies and purchasing policies. So if there was rules on audit policy, we wouldn't be having this discussion.
I should just pause here and re-explain what the JC, and it's just, the letters confuse me too. It's the JCLS. It's a Joint Committee on Legislative Services, and it is, Gary, it's the executive arm of the General Assembly, comprised of the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, the Speaker's Majority Leader, and the House Minority Leader, and then the Senate Minority Leader. It has 3 House members, 2 Senate members, and that 5-person official board comprises the JCLS. And then there's an office, which of course had mold and blah, 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 and all that saga that confused everybody last week. But it has an office of what are the operating employees, the general management of the General Assembly.
It's the administrative arm of the General Assembly.
Right.
And it administers, the General Assembly's budget's about $47 million. It's, but, we have an Auditor General, we have a House Fiscal Staff, we have a Legislative Council, and those are discrete items in the budget. The money that the Joint Committee has is about 25 to 27 million, and yet its employees don't have job descriptions. They don't evaluate against job descriptions. They don't have regularly scheduled meetings. There's confusion about what policy and process are, and those are very simple things to clear up.
To say that they don't have regularly scheduled meetings would be the understatement of the century. Members of the Joint Committee can't remember the last one they had. And reportedly over the last 10 years there might be 1 or 2, and they were perfunctory in nature, seemingly. So,
yeah. But my point was that 25 years ago, we looked at how the legislature was being operated. It's really a 19th century institution that's trying to cope with the 21st century. And we said there are very simple things to do. Professionalize your operations, know what to expect from your employees, have regular meetings, adopt procedures. So when the committee was going to order an audit, there was procedures to follow. It wasn't black magic that just came up. I have more transparent budgets. I can't tell you what the budget is for the Rhode Island House of Representatives or the Rhode Island Senate. I can tell you what the budget is in total for the joint committee, but they're cost centers. It's a basic practice. There should be cost centers, so a member can look at the budget, taxpayer can look at the budget and say, it costs this much money to operate our house.
Okay, when we come back, I'm going to talk about some more of Gary's ideas and suggestions, which seem like a really basic consultancy, like a managerial consultancy, but there's a culture problem. We'll talk about it next. So there is Blake Filippi, the state representative from South County in Block Island, and he is the minority leader of the Republican Party. He is the one who helped to accelerate the controversy regarding the JCLS. He sits on that board as the minority leader, as we previously explained. There are 5 positions, and he sued his own chair, the Speaker of the House, over the decision to audit the Convention Center Authority, which to most accounts seems like a personal and political move on the part of the Speaker. We are talking about the bigger picture here with Gary Sasse in terms of how the government runs and the like, but I want to go back to some of what would be your specific recommendations to reform the JCLS, stuff that I think would fall into the category of just top-notch managerial consultation to an organization. But before we get to that part, let's talk about the culture that has caused the lack of transparency, the power that the statutes of Rhode Island and the Constitution provide to the General Assembly and to the Speaker himself or herself, and then the consensus that kind of flows from that, which is that the Speaker's really running the show.
Right.
Any speaker. Way back, many speakers.
And so there are certain things that you have to do that can help change the culture. You can't take politics out of politics, nor would you want to. You want the political system to be accountable, but you can structure it in such a way that helps. So, for example, term limits. What if we adopted an amendment to the Constitution or a statute that said nobody could serve as Speaker for more than 8 years?
But wait a second, Gary. Before we get to that, I mean, you're my wonky guy, you're my procedure guy, you're my new policy guy, you're all those guys. But you're also, dirty little secret, Gary's pretty savvy politically. The politics of this, the changes in the General Assembly have to come from the General Assembly.
Right, but you've got to create a climate and a structure where it makes those changes possible. So right now there's no motivation. The Speaker is absolute control. The Speaker controls the Joint Committee, but yet when you look at the responsibilities of the House and Senate, they both have very important responsibilities. The budget starts in the House, but the Senate is responsible for confirmation of judges and all types of high-level public officials. So how do you create a system that recognizes that power and that responsibility? How do you recognize a system, where the Speaker has ultimate control over what comes in and out of a committee?
But my question, my friend, is, and I want to get to those questions, and I know the answers that you provide, but my question is, how do you get to the question? I wonder if it's only going to be inspired by, and I have, I'm not making any predictions. Where am I? I'm not going to make any predictions on this. I just think that the kind of systemic change to the change, meaning the culture change, the question change, to ask the right questions, to make the changes, might only come with the Speaker either resigning or being taken out of office.
See, that's always the concept. But how many speakers are you aware of that left office in disgrace, and they went through the motions of saying, we're going to change the process, we're going to make it more accountable, we're going to open things up, and nothing really changes. So tell me the difference today between the leadership of Gordon Fox and the subsequent leaders of the General Assembly. Tell me the difference of leaders that go back to Harry Curvin 50 and 60 years ago. The point is that the institution is operating with 19th century, on a 19th century basis, and the problems are very different. And my argument is that you can't change things by partisan sniping. You've got to create a structure that makes it more difficult for these guys to do that.
But you know what this is like? This is kind of like a Rubik's Cube discussion that you and I are having, because I'm saying, I get it. You got to get the squares all the same color. I get it. But how do you turn it? Well, you turn it by turning like this. Yeah, but I don't know.
Well,
I don't. What creates that political will? Is it the governor that comes in and takes a bully pulpit? You know, she seems to be exhausted to me. Does she make the argument? Who stands to put the pressure on the General Assembly to consider all of the wonderful ideas that I'm sure you have?
Well, there's a lot of things that put the pressure on. You know, certainly the potential of a scandal puts it on, the potential of corruption puts it on. But at the end of the day, you can have scandal after scandal, you can have pledges of reform after reform, and what you and I are really talking about, if we want to square the Rubik's Cube, is how do you get people to run for the Assembly that have the kind of culture and values that we're talking about.
That will change the system.
And I'm saying that you can see, this is where you and I are not connecting, but this is the thing. I'm saying you can encourage those kind of people to run if you create a system where they think they can exercise some responsibility. So, for example, when I'm...
But it's catch-22.
But no, it doesn't have to be. So I'm a wonkish, and I talk about professionalizing the legislature.
I say that with love, by the way.
I understand that. But I talk about professionalizing the legislature. Well, if members of the committees had access to policy and research staff so they could generate ideas, they can get more involved in the development of solutions to the problems the state faces, as opposed to a top-down process, you begin to attract people. Now, I can't guarantee that. I can't get into one's mind and say that's going to happen, but I do know that when you create incentives for people to be successful, then you get more successful people wanting to participate. And that's a big part of it. And when you do the sessions, the resources you give these people are factors that will encourage people to run potentially. Not always, I can't guarantee it, but those are the kinds of things you have to do to set the table so you can make the cultural changes.
Here's the conundrum. So you're saying you want new, fresh voices, you don't care which party, to I'm sure, to talk about the way the General Assembly functions. That's not necessarily a marketable thing on the street. Running on, making the General Assembly work more efficiently versus, the major things on taxation and health care and all those kinds of things. It's hard for the constituents to get their minds wrapped around a cleaner operating General Assembly.
But it shouldn't be that hard to get their minds around. Let's take taxes. If all tax policy comes from the top down, and you want to run for the legislature, and you say, why the hell should I run for the legislature? I think taxes are too high or too low or unfair, or, whatever. But if I go up to the legislature, I'm going to sit around, and then they're going to give me the solution, and I'll vote yes for the solution, and no for the solution. I'm saying that's the culture you have to change. You have to make it look like an appealing place where people can think they can make a positive contribution to the state. And oftentimes, that's difficult. I'm suggesting that the way you can do it with no guarantee is there's certain things you got to do to make that, to encourage that, to build incentives. You can't take politics out of politics, but don't let somebody be Speaker for more than 8 years or Senate President for more than 8 years. You have parity between the House and the Senate on the joint committee.
By the way, when you talk about term limits, you're not suggesting that the Speaker can't be elected to his own district, but the leadership of the General Assembly.
Create churn. See, now if you want to encourage people to run for the legislature, give them some hope that they too could be in a position of responsibility. Right now it's not the case. And so if there's term limits on the Speaker, on the Senate President, possibly on the Majority Leader, I don't know how far to go, then people that run can get into the pecking order and maybe get into position.
Let me, when I come back, I'm going to give Gary one example of how all these great ideas won't happen until, and I'm not sure what the until is, but stay tuned.
Until the hunt.
By the way, the conversation never slowed down during the break, but here's the thing. Line item veto. Good idea?
Yes.
Speaker, Senate President, no way, man. So, we got Master Lever. They didn't want it either, but Ken Block and others and guys like you worked it. But getting the line item veto is impossible in that General Assembly.
That's not true. And let me because the people that are blamed are not the legislature. Just to be honest, one of the good things that was done is that every 10 years, The people of this state have to vote as to whether or not they want to hold a constitutional convention. I chaired the effort last time to encourage people to vote yes. We got killed by every interest group in the state, and this wasn't... No,
On a lie.
but this wasn't
about the motive of the Constitutional Convention.
You know, the people who are pro-choice, on abortion.
They took it hostage.
Right, and so the people are the problem, because you talk about educating the people. It's not the legislature. Legislature did their job. They gave the people of the state an opportunity to call a convention every 10 years. If we had called a convention, there's no doubt in my mind we'd had a line item veto. We couldn't get there because interest groups on the left, some interest groups on the right, but primarily on the left, were afraid of the convention. They were afraid that if you had a convention, they would do things that those people felt were not.
And ironically, a lot of people on the left are the ones that are fit to be tied with the speaker right now. So there's a lot of water running in two different directions of the same pipe. I don't want you to feel like your trip was wasted. If I could rub like Bewitched and rub my nose and say, okay, we're going to do all the reforms. Again, 90 seconds. Bang, 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 bang. What do we do?
Well, and these are things to create incentives, okay? You create parity on the joint committee, so you don't have the speaker have so
Meaning
much,
the House and the Senate have the same power.
3 people each. You create the term limits on the position of Speaker and Senate President. You force the joint committee to adopt personnel regulations and evaluate their people. So there's these professional staff there that'll look to the Speaker or the Senate President and say, I think that's a dumb idea. Still may do it anyhow, but create that professional kind of technique. You create budget centers, or cost centers, so you know what different things are important costing you. Those are the kinds of things.
And how about this? Give the Republican minority a budget to run their office. The Republicans have to ask the Democratic Speaker for permission to hire a secretary, for crying out loud.
Well, see, that's part of the budget center thing. I can't go break down each down, but right now what we have, and this is the truth, I think, is we have partisan sniping. So one side tries to take advantage of the error of the other side. They score a few points, and then the world goes on after they've scored those few points. No one ever wins the game. The people never win this game. And there's no guarantee that you can take politics out of politics, but you can create a structure which makes the process potentially more constructive.
Well, here's the thing. I don't know when, how, who we're going to create an environment that says, you know what, we should redo this thing. Blake Filippi's lawsuit may be catalytic to it. It may be catalytic to it. But if we create an environment in the General Assembly that says we got to reform the way we operate, that's when you bring Gary in. He gives you the outline, and we're done.
See, but the problem is, we had a Blue Ribbon Commission, which is a pretty good commission, 1992.
Yeah, how'd that work out?
It worked out. Certain things worked out well. Reduced the size of the legislature, eliminated pensions, which everybody thought about.
True.
Made the compensation rational. So it did all the governance procedures things that were recommended. They helped. The legislature has done things
All right, well,
better.
30 years later, it's time again.
But 30 years later, but because of patronage, because of power and control, it refused to confront the issues of management reform, and that's where we are today. And the Republicans can scream till Christmas. Until you make the management reforms, they're just blowing in the wind.
Got it? Good. Thank you, friend. Final word and we come back. You know that old phrase, if there's a will, there's a way? The will has got to be created. Maybe this saga at the State House will create the will. Who knows? But he figured out the way. Have a great weekend. Good night.